Oh, it's another, what is it today? What's the date today? Wednesday? Wednesday, yeah. So lunchtime again. John Bozeka.
Noah Hiles.
How about that? How do you like that? I think they should
I hope
that.
they like it.
I think they should know that at that point. I've been saying that now for a couple weeks, but I really feel that at this point, if we've done this right, they should know who we are.
I mean, our names are on the podcast, too. That always helps.
It does. It
yes.
tends to.
And now we're on video. Second episode on video. New camera angle, as you can see. So they can see what we look like.
Trying out new technology.
There we go.
Technology, but... So, Cavaliers going to have a new coach, JB Bickerstaff now, due to the fact that John Beilein and the Cavaliers have kind of mutually agreed to part ways, if you will. Mm-hmm. I think this was probably a long time coming since the...
I wouldn't call it a long time coming.
No, I think it was, though.
But it's been less than a year.
It has been. But the thugs comment, I think that's what kind of started turning the wheels the other way. You know, and it seems like it's been a long time because when a team loses, it seems like the coach has been there a longer period of time.
It sure does.
So, you know, it seems like he's been here now for what's more than just a year, but it's not even a year.
No, they paid him a lot of money to win 12 games.
14.
14? Was that it? Okay, but...
Don't come down on my Cavaliers.
Okay,
like
sorry, my bad. I was interested in this hire to begin with because college to pro in any sport is always an interesting transition. We've seen it work at times. I would say Billy Donovan has been one that's worked. Brad Stevens has been one that's worked. But we've also seen it fail. And I'd say we see it fail more often than not. And not just in basketball, but in other sports. I mean, you think of guys like Nick Saban, probably the best college football coach ever. Horrible NFL coaching career. So, and I think that the reason it fails with this kind of stuff, when it's college guys to the pros, it's the authoritarian coach never really seems to work out. And it's a guy who, you know, those kids at Michigan, they had nothing else. I mean, that was their lifeline, was basketball. So they had to do whatever this guy told them. They were forced to buy in, where you need to be more relatable when you're dealing with professionals who are A, making more money than you, and B, are, at the end of the day, especially in basketball, far more important to the organization.
See, and I don't ever know that it's an indictment of the coach that it doesn't work at the pros. I think it's an indictment of the fact that once players get to the pro level, they're just less likely to listen to a coach. Okay. So, like, you could have the best coach in the world, and if players don't want to listen to them, then
you gotta change it up.
Yeah, you have nothing that you can do. Like, for example, like I thought when the Cavs had David Blatt, I didn't think David Blatt was a bad coach. Just like I don't think John Beilein is a bad coach. Mm-mm. But it's a matter of that what he does, the way he coaches, his style, his game plans, his things like that, his way that he handles things off the court with talking to players and doing different things, those are more college-esque. Whereas in the pros, once you get to that level, it becomes basically you just manage the talent. You don't like...
You're their manager. You're the talent manager.
You don't do X's and O's as much.
And that,
you do, but you don't.
And you saw that, I think, Steve Kerr exemplified that when... You know, he's coaching a Warriors team last year that's won back-to-back championships, 3 out of the last 4. And how do you keep them engaged in a blowout win? Well, he allows his players to coach during a game. You remember when he did that last year. You do things like that to keep people engaged, and that's a perfect example of... I mean, Kerr definitely knows the X's and O's. He's a great coach. But he knows how to manage the personalities that come with an NBA roster.
I would venture to say that there's more coaches that allow their players to do that than you would imagine.
Yeah, I would say so, too.
You know, I mean, especially if you have... Here's the thing. If you have a seasoned veteran on your roster that's a perennial all-star, so like a LeBron or a D-Wade when he was still in the league, or like Chris Paul right
Kobe,
now. Like, yeah, those guys... If that guy comes into the huddle and he says, scrap that play, I have a better one, you're going to listen to what the guy says.
So, John, we were talking about this off the air before the show got started, and it feels like this is a newer trend where coaches are... Their shelf life of a coach, especially in the NBA, it doesn't seem to last. I mean, this is... I mean, how many coaches have the Cavs had since LeBron was drafted originally?
Oh, my goodness. They had Paul Silas.
We don't need to go through the full list, but it's been a lot. So I did some research to see if this recency thing, there's 40% of the coaches today in the NBA, so 12 of the 30 of them have been with their team for 5 or more seasons. 40%. Now, would you argue, is that good or bad, would you say?
What, that only 40%
have been with their team for 5 years?
I mean, I think that's about the normal shelf life for a coach anymore, because really what pro sports comes down to is that it's a make or miss, win or lose league. So if you're not winning championships, then you're going to leave.
Now, it's interesting that you say that. So I looked over the past 4 decades in the NBA and coaches getting hired and fired. So I looked through from the 80s to this past decade, 2010s. In the 80s, out of the 27 teams, granted 23 of them played the entire decade, 4 teams were new midway through. 0 teams in the 1980s had the same coach through the entire decade. 0. That number improved to 1 in the 1990s. It then doubled to 2 in the 2000s. And then this past decade, there were 3 teams who happened to be the Spurs, the Heat, and the Mavericks went through the entire decade with the same head coach.
Yeah,
so
Popovich,
right there,
Carlisle, and Spoelstra.
Yes, correct. And all 3 of those guys have won championships.
They have.
So if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right?
In the case of a couple of them, they've won multiple championships,
now,
which is helpful.
If you go back in those decades again and you look, well, how many teams had 2 coaches? Maybe one guy was there for just a couple years and then they got it right. Well, 5 teams in the 1980s, which is 19% of the league, had a coach with them for at least half the decade.
Yeah, but that kind of makes sense, because if you really look at it, like 19% of the league is basically all that's really capable of winning a championship each and every year.
That number remains relatively consistent through time, too. It was 14% in the 90s, and it's been at 17% in the 2000s and the 2010s. So now, that was teams with 2 head coaches. So now we look at head coaches who spent at least 5 years with one team during a decade. 14% of head coaches in the 1980s were with a team for 5 or more seasons. That number was cut in half in the 1990s. Just 7% of head coaches. If you coached in the NBA in the 1990s, only 7% of the coaches stayed with the team for at least half a decade. That number went up to 13% overall for the last 2 decades, the 2010s. And then we get to the Cleveland Cavs situation, franchises that had 4 or more head coaches in the same decade. 37% of the league had that happen to them in the 80s. 69% of the league had 4 or more head coaches in the 1990s. 46% of the league had 4 or more head coaches in the 2000s. And the numbers back up to 60% now, where they're firing everyone again, it seems.
So, well, I think the reason why that's happened at such a huge level over the course of time is because if you look at the 80s, that's really when the superstar, was starting to take. I sound like Elmer.
That's when the modern NBA started.
I sound like Elmer over here.
Yeah,
that's when the superstar started to really take over, becoming more important to a team. Like, if I remember correctly, and I have to look at your sheet here, but Magic Johnson, when he first was with the LA Lakers, I need to find it on here.
This is the 80s.
Paul Westhead was the coach to start, and then Paul and Magic Johnson didn't get along. So Pat Riley came in and was a long tenured coach for them, but he didn't even survive to the end of the decade, or did he? I think
no, he did. He made it through. Yeah, he survived right to the end.
But it's a case of that because you had the modern athlete starting to take over the game more, that's why you had more turnover. And I think as time has gone by, in the 90s, it was really MJ's league. So, like, there wasn't as much of a reason for turnover, I feel, in the 90s, even though you did have a lot of coaches that didn't survive 4 more seasons. I feel because everybody was kind of chasing MJ, they were like, well, we kind of know what we're playing for.
See, I
second place.
I think these numbers show, and I have thoughts on both of those comments. I think these numbers show the polarization of you're either committed or you're scatterbrained. There's 4 organizations, really, who have had 4+ head coaches in every single decade that I examined. The Kings, the Knicks, the Warriors, and the Grizzlies. The Grizzlies only the 90s through the 2010s because they didn't exist in the 80s. But that just shows the inconsistency there.
I mean, the Knicks make sense because the Knicks have been, the team that can't shoot straight.
The Kings made 1 conference final during that 4-year span.
And it's crazy to think the Knicks have been there because the Knicks have had opportunities.
The Knicks have been to the finals.
Where they should have won a finals or been in a position to, at least,
I mean, they were 2 games away
years.
in, like, 94, I believe.
Yeah, so, I mean, they had their opportunities, but again, it was the MJ factor. The fact that, you had, again, it was a blessing and it was also a curse at the same time because, like, if you just realize that, like, look, he's going to have his shelf life and then eventually he's going to be out of the league. Like, if you did that and you stuck with a coach, you were like Utah, and you probably had Jerry Sloan, and you just stuck with him and said, well, we're going to just play for second every year. Or you were in a situation like the Knicks, who were always trying to better themselves.
You bring up the MJ factor, and I looked this up. So I thought about the LeBron and the MJ factor, where pretty much the entire 1990s and the entire 2010s, those decades in the Eastern Conference belonged to whatever team LeBron James was on and the Chicago Bulls. However, the teams that had 4 or more head coaches in those decades in the 90s, the West had more teams with 4+ head coaches than teams in the East did. And the same could be said when LeBron was in the 2010s. If you take the Cavs out of the equation, because he was on the Cavs, that means there were 17 teams that had 4 or more head coaches throughout the last decade, and only 8 of them belonged to the Eastern Conference, whereas 9 of them were in the West.
I think a lot of this also boils down to the fact, though, of who your GM is. Like, I look at the Heat as being a perfect example of
Pat
this.
Riley
like,
gets it.
Pat Riley is the GM, and Pat Riley was a long-time tenured coach with the LA Lakers. He won championships, so he understands that having a guy like Eric Spoelstra, who was young when he took over, and yes, Riley had to coach him up. Like, we all famously remember watching Pat Riley on TV in the stands taking notes on a clipboard during a playoff game, but it's a case of he realizes that now that he has a guy like Spoelstra, look at the Heat again. They've gone through peaks and valleys where they won championships because they had superstars, and now they've gotten players back, and Spoelstra is ready again to be a playoff head coach that can lead them deep into the playoffs.
Again, I've got information that contradicts that argument, though, John. Because there's only been 3 teams who have avoided, how I marked it, the blue marker here on my notes, if you can see.
He's trying to block my face.
If you get a blue marker on my notes here, that means that you've had 4 more coaches in a decade. There's only been 3 teams in the last 40 years to avoid going a decade with 4 or more head coaches. Those teams were the Boston Celtics, the Portland Trail Blazers, and the Utah Jazz. So out of those 3, only one of them won a championship. And the Boston Celtics, if you take out the 80s, have won 1 in the last 30 years from the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. So consistency might not necessarily mean championships, because if you look at the teams on the list here, the Lakers, 3 of the last 4 decades, they've had 4+ head coaches in a decade.
But I think
they've won championships. The Detroit Pistons, 3 of the last 4 times. The Cavs fall into that category. The Bulls fall into that category. And the Golden State Warriors fall into that category. So it might not be about remaining consistent. It's about possibly finding the right guy. You look at what the Bulls did throughout the whole 80s. I think they had 5 head coaches. Then they stumbled upon Phil Jackson. They didn't need to hire anyone else. So maybe what the Cavs are doing is the right thing, you could argue. It's you keep firing everybody until you find the right guy. It might look like you're scatterbrained. It might look frustrating. But in the end of the day, when you stumble upon a Steve Kerr or a Phil Jackson or a Pat Riley, you got your guy. And it has to be the right time, right place. And Beilein clearly wasn't in the right time or the right place.
See, now I would argue, though, that even though all that data presents, like, a different thought that, hey, that works, I mean, I would also argue that you're at a case where if you do have consistency, like, I take Utah as being the perfect example of this. Utah,
what they do, like 20 years straight to the playoffs or something?
But, like, they have not had many head coaches since the 1980s. Like, they've had, 1, 2, 3...
I mean, they had the whole 90s.
Basically, 6. And, like, again, they haven't won a championship, but they are regularly in the playoffs. They are regularly competing to go to the playoffs. And, again, the reason why I think that's the case is because they've hired a guy, they've stuck with him, they've let him coach them through the bad times and through the good times, and because of that, you always have a guy that understands what it's basically like to be a wartime coach that can go into the battles. And I think those are the teams, the Spurs are the perfect example of it, that if you keep a guy, you're going to win championships.
And I would say that
it doesn't work. It doesn't always work, though, and that's sports. That's the imperfection that is sports.
Well, what also helps your theory is, like, you look at, like, the Bulls. the Bulls didn't fire Phil Jackson; he retired.
Yeah,
and
of course.
And same for the Pistons. You know, you win those championships, and a coach is like, okay, I've accomplished everything that I'd hoped to. So in those cases where you make those changes, they're not necessarily by choice. And I would say that the Cavs, when you look at how they run their team as a business, they should not be operating the same way the Los Angeles Lakers or the Chicago Bulls do. Because those are big-time cities who can attract free agents and do other things. They should be modeling themselves like the Utah Jazz, because that's a mid-market team that's only going to win a championship by a product of remaining consistent, similar to what you saw from the Dallas Mavericks, the Toronto Raptors. Even though that's a bigger city, they're not necessarily a well-renowned franchise. It's keep showing up to the dance, and eventually maybe you'll get to go home the winner.
Well, but the thing is like I look at a guy like Mike Fratello, who was the Cavs coach through the 90s, and again, they weren't the best team in the NBA, they weren't the worst team in the NBA, but they were consistently like a 5, 6, 7, 8 seed. And like obviously fans didn't like that because you were stuck in the middle, but the thing is that if you want consistency for a franchise, that's the type of guy that you want to go after.
And I think that's the problem here that we're seeing in today's society. People aren't okay with being a 6 seed every year anymore. I know that's what you want, but now the goal is...
I want to make the playoffs after winning a title.
Yes. Now the goal is you're either good enough to win a championship or you're tanking to build a team that establishes a young core, and then you'll get a superstar to come to you in free agency, and you're either going to be the top or bottom. The middle ground is the worst ground to be in today's NBA, and I think that's what these kind of numbers reflect.
See, but like you look at teams of this past decade, and if teams did have a little bit more consistency, maybe some of these teams would have titles. And the teams that are still consistently competing now, I mean, they've stuck with the same guy. I mean, I think Miami's going to be in the Eastern Conference Finals this year. I think Boston has a good chance. They've tenured Brad Stevens for a while. I think Greg Popovich, obviously they're down because they don't have the superstars that they once did, but the teams that are good are the teams that have hired a guy and, I mean, for lack of a better term, have kind of stuck with him.
Let us know what you think. Is it better to keep looking for the right guy, or do you stick with someone for multiple years and let it ride out? Tweet at us on social media, at Noah_Hiles95.
At John Bozeka. I can say this, I'm Team JB Bickerstaff now. 100%.
Yeah? Oh, you're all in?
I was in on
This
John,
is a guy that wanted to keep Freddie Kitchens.
I was in on John Beilein.
For the record.
Hey, don't do that to
me. For the
me.
record.
Don't do that to me. That's not fair. I mean, I wanted to keep him because I'm a fan of consistency. Whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent.
This is a guy who cheers for a team who fired their coach mid-season and won their only championship.
I didn't like the firing, though. I was not a fan of it. I wanted them to keep
You seemed to like the 2016 finals, though, didn't you?
I did. But I also think a lot of that was due to the players, too.
Just some food for thought. Can I give my no-doubters now?
Sure, I don't like how you just came at me at the end there.
Oh, John, come on.
You kind of did, though. You didn't have to do that.
It's a debate show. Listen, you see this guy right here for the people watching the video? Look at him. His beautiful face.
Don't do that.
All right, well, you know what I'm going to do to make it up for you is I'm going to put money in your pocket. Noah's no doubters, 10-7 on the year. 10-7 on the year. We went 3-0 on Monday. So here's free money if you want it, folks. UCF Cincinnati under 136 points. Take that to the bank. Syracuse +9. Take that to the bank. And Edmonton Oilers +165. Those are my no doubters. John, I'm sorry.
He says that he's a no-doubter, but he only gets them right 59% of the time. That's an F in a grading scale.
It sure is. That sure is.
I'm John Bozeka.
I'm Noah Hiles. We'll see you next time.